Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for those who are joining. It's been a busy week back to work for all of us. No rest for the policy weary. I'm joined today by Jameson Spivack of our team. Jameson works on a whole range of issues, key on our AI center, and in particular has been doing some really interesting work on what we've been calling data-driven pricing. You see critics calling it maybe surveillance pricing or other, sometimes even nastier terminology. So we're going to talk about that. And given the announcement this week, was it yesterday? Yeah, I think yesterday, the day before, of ChatGPT announcing a separate, I tested, I don't know how they get, I guess they're rolling it out. You have to get on a waiting list. Research shows that a vast number of people have been asking ChatGPT health-related questions, and they have added a dedicated health-related tab that's going to have some additional protections. So we'll talk about that as well. But let's, I guess, start with the data-driven pricing, and always helpful to define, I think, exactly what we're talking about. Because there's a range of ways, obviously, when you go to a airline side, you call an Uber, you go to a website, retail, that prices are determined for you. And some of it, I won't say it's not controversial, right? When Uber started surge pricing, people were like, wait, what? What do you mean? That's not cool. I call a taxi, there's no surge pricing. I call a car service, there's no surge pricing. Of course, you just can't get one when it is super. Do people still call car services? I guess in some significant areas of the country, of the world. I haven't called a car service in a long time. But I do remember how hard it was to get a car on a rainy day or a snowy day. You were being put on hold. Yeah, we'll have some, and they didn't have one for you, but they would keep you there because maybe eventually they would. And they'd be like, yeah, it's on the way. And they probably hadn't even dispatched it yet. It was such a headache. And obviously surge pricing, as annoying as it is when, you suddenly see that it's so expensive to go across town, it obviously gets some of those Uber drivers out of bed or, hey, I'm going to work because the market demand is working. So, Jameson, can you help us sort of maybe frame, what are we or what aren't we talking about when we focus on this more recent tension the last year, maybe 2 years, that really has consumer advocates particularly incensed?
Yeah, thanks, Jules. So the conversation that we're seeing around surveillance or algorithmic pricing is actually about a bundle of distinct but overlapping pricing practices, which, as you mentioned, we've been calling data-driven pricing. And each strategy works a little bit differently, implicates unique policy considerations. But generally speaking, the conversation has centered around whether the use of sophisticated algorithms to change prices in real time or in near real time based on consumers' personal data is helping consumers by lowering prices, or as you mentioned in the case of ride-sharing apps, increasing demand or increasing supply rather, or whether these practices are actually being used to take advantage of consumers in potentially invasive ways. So some of the major practices that we see are dynamic pricing, which is what people are probably the most familiar with in the case of ride-hailing apps and flight booking sites, where prices change rapidly in response to changing conditions. So often that means supply and demand. Sometimes it could be based on personal data as well. There's also algorithmic pricing, which is the use of an automated system to determine prices based on an analysis of various kinds of input data. The term is not necessarily particularly helpful because in many cases, pricing has for a long time been set by algorithms. So, particularly large companies are analyzing market conditions and competitor prices and consumer sentiment in order to determine prices and set those prices. And they've been using algorithms to set those prices for a long time. What people probably care most about is when algorithmic pricing is personalized or when it's dynamic. So That brings me to the last category, which is what people are calling surveillance pricing or personalized pricing. And that's offering different consumers varying prices based on personal data. It could be individualized, so based on your shopping data, based on your specific age, but it could also be based on aggregated or group data. So, things like discounts for military veterans or personnel, or for teachers or for seniors. That's been common for a while. Kind of a subset of that is loyalty programs or rewards programs, which is a form of personalized pricing that involves customers receiving special deals or other rewards in return for repeat purchases and or sharing personal data. So really, people are referring to kind of a lot of different pricing strategies, some of which are not necessarily new, some of which are very new, some of which kind of fall somewhere in between. They're kind of just an extension of practices that companies have been doing for a while.
If you want to dive deeper, take a look at the link that we just posted, or some of the work that Jameson has done, posted at the FPF blog. So to recap, and I think it's a good way to think about it, there's sort of the stuff that has long happened, and we may love it, we may not, but there are probably reasonable market reasons and legitimate business reasons if disclosed reasonably. The airline, you wait the last minute, you're going to pay a higher price. Even Amtrak now is sort of doing a bit more yield management. You buy in advance, you buy last minute. If it's the early morning flight, the demand drives the pricing, the surge type pricing, the scarcity type pricing. We've all seen sort of eBay and Amazon, and so nothing new there. Then let's take that loyalty program category. Some of the new state laws that restrict sale of data, or shall we say, require businesses to give you an option to deny the sale of data, have had exceptions for loyalty programs. And some of the critics have pushed back more recently, arguing, these loyalty programs really all such a bargain? Are there places where people are in the loyalty program, they're providing data, but are they really getting a better deal or not? And so I think that can be sort of, debated and discussed. I think most of us generally see some benefit to loyalty programs, but it's certainly true that you might be a very loyal coffee customer, having your 2 cups every day at Starbucks, and you earn your stars, and some person who only occasionally buys coffee at Starbucks might get some really, really good offers, because you're probably not going to consume 3 or 4 cups a day at Starbucks, and this person is probably having their coffee elsewhere. And so, there are certainly going to be circumstances where maybe somebody new is going to get some sort of introductory offer that is better than a loyalty program. So we can sort of debate whether or not the loyalty programs are all very good. Some seem to be very good and come with all sorts of benefits. And then maybe others people ought to be a little more skeptical about. But I think the third category that you talked about is the one that maybe gets us all ick. And it takes a lot to ick, me. I grew up in the world of behavioral advertising in my first kind of privacy job many years ago at DoubleClick. And so, we may love or may not love, but I appreciate the fact that, showing ads just generically versus you visited a site and they immediately start retargeting you, that is a much more valuable ad for the advertiser. They're, reaching someone who already showed some interest. They get paid a lot more for that. It's probably more relevant to people. Sometimes it's annoying. I already purchased. Why are you chasing me around the internet? It doesn't ick me out. I know how it works. I get it. There's an ick factor, I think, that even all of us who work in data and sort of understand, look, there are some economics here. The notion that, and this is what Instagram recently was, Instacart was recently sort of critiqued about. A number of experts pointed out that when they went to the same store, but logged in, through multiple accounts, they would see a different price, even though they were similarly situated. Something was going on, and it turns out that the stores were experimenting. Instagram provided a sort of a tool where the stores could experiment and try to figure out, what price they wanted to offer. And then Instagram, because of the pushback, said, we're not going to allow that anymore. And so there's this feeling that I think I go to a page, and maybe because of how I moused around, or maybe they know my income, or maybe they know how desperate I am for the product for some reason based on some, data about me. And so the algorithm is somehow, using AI to maximize and get the best price against me, and then realizing that to get someone else, maybe they've got to offer a different price, right? And it just seems unfair in some way that is really, I think, driving a lot of the angst. The proposals to deal with this, though, I think are really hard, right? Because there are, and we've talked to companies about this, we've said, listen, this is something that policymakers care about. Can we come up with some thinking, some principles where we say, look, here's the kind of thing that's legitimate, offering someone a discount to try to, get them to buy and so forth, that can be good for users. And then here's the kind of thing that just seems unfair, just seems to be like you're using the data on your side to maximize against me. And at the end of the day, is just going to like drive up prices, or maybe charge certain people more than others in ways that doesn't seem fair. But really hard to capture this, right? I mean, New York, is it New York and other states that have put proposals that are already in law that require this price has been set by an algorithm. I think you sort of mentioned that that's super unhelpful, because every particular company now needs to say that, and it doesn't really distinguish from the fact that maybe this was set by an algorithm because like our inventory is low, so we're like raising prices or something like that. Can you say a bit more about the way legislators are responding to try to help or do something in this area?
Yeah, so lawmakers are really trying to strike this balance that you've articulated, by prohibiting clearly harmful scenarios like price gouging or discrimination or exploitation, which can be kind of tricky to define, but I think generally a lot of people might agree on what some of those are. But also not prevent companies from offering loyalty programs, bona fide loyalty programs, personalized discounts, other things that consumers might enjoy. A lot of companies will say, well, we would never use personalized pricing or algorithmic pricing to raise prices, only to lower prices and help consumers. And this is probably true in many cases, but it's a little more complicated than that. And so what lawmakers have generally done is introduced bills targeting a few different things. So last year in 2025, there was a lot of focus on the use of algorithmic pricing or personalized pricing in the context of housing, for rent setting, and in grocery stores and food establishments. So either requiring disclosure or downright or outright prohibiting the use of personalized pricing or algorithmic pricing. And this kind of reflects the more general concern that people have about consequential AI or high-risk AI. These are essentials. People need to have housing, and they need to have food, and we just don't want those practices to be used in those settings. Interestingly, what we've seen so far in 2026, and it's early, but the focus has expanded beyond these specific industries in niche areas, and it's much more general. It's prohibiting personalized algorithmic pricing in retail writ large. And I think that that might be in response to some of the backlash that we've seen against certain companies' plans to use certain kinds of algorithmic pricing. And so I think that there's still concern about specific contexts of these practices, but it's expanding to retail in general.
Yeah, I was speaking to one company, and I'm like, look, couldn't we all agree that offering a different price, maybe based on how long you lingered on a page, ought not to be okay? And they said, well, the marketing people, if you're leaving a page after having spent a lot of time maybe looking at different products, maybe they want to pop a coupon like, don't go, 10% discount. Like, do you have a problem with that? I said, well, that's not so bad. I said, well, but that's what you would be restricting if, you said it can't be based on how long somebody's on that page. I remember a big uproar many, many years ago when it turned out that there were companies that were offering, weren't offering different prices, but they were offering different kinds of vacations depending on which browser you were using. The thinking was that if you were a Mac user and you were using, Safari, well, then maybe you were a bit more affluent than a cheaper desktop user. And so you got offered an expensive vacation. And if you were not a Mac user, you got offered a cheaper vacation. So yes, it was a different price, but it was also like a different, product. And that got people super upset. They just felt like that wasn't, fair. And I think that scared away a lot of companies for a long time from doing anything in that regard. But right now, people do A/B testing like for everything, right? Like, should the homepage be blue or red? Should the, which image with the offer, did better? So it's not a surprise, that you said, well, what's the optimal price for like the product, right? Like, how do you price some of these things? I mean, you look at your competitors, just like you kind of test. And so, it shouldn't be a surprise that sometimes things appear at different levels in the market, and to properly test, you can't just do all in the morning or the afternoon or just this location or that location, because there might be differences in the demographic there. The logical way to test kind of what the optimal price, might be would be, maybe every third person gets this one and every fourth person gets this one, and you do something to sort of randomize. That means people end up seeing perhaps, different prices. Should that not be, allowed? You might just do your calculation on a spreadsheet as opposed to sort of doing it real time. Anyway, super hard. My take is that this issue will not go away. It just bothers people. One of the leaders in criticizing some of these practices has been Sam Levine, formerly of the FTC under Lina Khan. And yes, he's the new Consumer Affairs Commissioner for New York City. I guess I don't think you can call, I was the Consumer Affairs Commissioner for New York City many, many, many years ago. In the interim, that agency also now does worker protections. For instance, New York City's got some laws to protect workers. So I guess it's now called something like the Consumer Affairs and Worker Protections or something like that. But anyway, the agency can enforce a kind of a mini FTC Act and state consumer protection laws and the like. And it would not be a surprise, given the Mamdani focus on affordability, key to him getting elected, that these sorts of issues are ones that will be pushed at a top level. And indeed, when I was at the agency, it's a small agency with far less drama than the police department and fire and the board of, education, these big, very significant agencies. And it took a lot for me to get on the mayor's agenda. And certainly the first week of the administration, consumer affairs was not on the agenda. But the first week of Mamdani, he held a press conference with the new commissioner to announce a range of different consumer protection type activities. So what's your sense? I mean, there are already bills being dropped in for 2026. This is an issue that is, I think, really going to be perhaps even more prominent this year than it was in the past.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So last year we saw, I think, over 50 bills introduced in the states, a couple at the federal level as well. And so far in 2026, we've already seen maybe 7 or 8 of them, some of which are rolling over from last year. And I think that this is a bipartisan issue. Most of the bills that we are looking at are introduced by Democrats, but really the affordability issue, it's bipartisan. It's an issue that's top of mind across the country for a lot of voters. And some of the backlash we've seen against data-driven pricing in the news is coming from both sides of the aisle. Some officials from the Trump administration, including from the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, in reaction to some of the news stories, shows that this is bipartisan, and especially with rising prices, it's top of mind for consumers. So I agree. I think that this will be a bigger issue going into 2026 than it even was last year.
I think it shows the complexity. There are obviously efforts at the federal level to pressure states not to do AI bills or to, the president's executive order to perhaps advance a federal, bill that would be preemptive. This is a good example of an AI-driven, issue that you can see why local, jurisdictions, cities, states feel that it is well within their jurisdiction and appropriate for them to provide protections to what may be an AI-driven solution. Okay, we are I know you've got more work coming out on this, so stay tuned, folks, on that. And we're going to continue thinking, how do we help articulate, whether it's best practices, whether it's legislative, how do we help articulate principles that allow legitimate, fair, honest, business practices that can be good for consumers because of competition, because of offers and low prices, but safeguard from behavior that seems to be too intrusive, too aggressive, unfair in some set of ways. What can responsible companies do to be on the right side of marketing in an ethical way? The other topic that we wanted to talk about just briefly was the ChatGPT announcement. And before we went live, I was asking Jameson, well, would you upload this? Would you upload that? And so maybe I'll start with, my confession. I've been using all the models, just obviously to understand and see how well they're working. But I've had a number of occasions to ask health-related issues, whether it's family members or myself. And, again, you got to check, you got to verify, just like when you're, Googling, you better be careful about what sites and what results, you get. But it's been remarkable how useful and effective. We've seen a couple of recent studies showing that I'm not alone. A vast number of people, a huge percent of people using ChatGPT. I mean, hundreds of millions of queries of people asking for health information. And for a lot of people in the actual, medical care space, their hair is on fire because obviously there are all sorts of well-known, failings, inaccuracies, and so on and so forth. But the reality is none of us have incredible access, unless you're living with a doctor. We don't have incredible access to the expertise, and it takes time, and it's hard to correspond and to be ready to ask all the questions when you do have an appointment. We don't all have insurance. Imperfect, but so useful that people are making rational decisions, even if they're aware of privacy concerns or of just quality, that this is valuable. I had a lab test some months ago. I had a minor patch of skin that needed to be checked. My dermatologist is my next door neighbor, and he is a friend. I can speak to him whenever I want. And when I, have an appointment, he treats me with great care, and he's a, real expert. And, obviously I've got, a reasonable legal background and some degree of expertise here. But when he discussed the lab report, it wasn't super clear, to me. I sort of understood, but I left with some questions, and I needed to follow up with a specialist. I uploaded the lab report, and the analysis that I got was enormously useful. And the set of questions that it helped me queue up for the specialist helped me have a much more expert and thoughtful discussion that really helped me, understand, what I needed to do and what I didn't need to do. Okay, so I'm coming from a little bit of the privileged, corner here. I was in an Uber the other day, and the Uber driver was telling me, and she was a recent immigrant, her English wasn't great, she didn't have health insurance, how much she depends on using an LLM while she's driving to ask all kinds of questions, and how critical it was when she had a medical appointment and she had done research and the doctor said one thing and she said, well, what about this? And he said, well, actually, that's a good point. Maybe we should go in that direction. How empowered she felt. But obviously the concerns, the issues, loading this sort of information, we know there are security issues, we know there are privacy issues, we know there are integrity and quality issues. So I was heartened to see OpenAI come out with a dedicated, more secure, more private tab that will segregate this data from your other queries, that will use a well-known sort of medical record data connector. Now, of course, they're now facilitating and encouraging, as a result, the upload of far more of this information. They promise that they're not going to be training on it. And I'm watching a lot of, the experts in the space who provide HIPAA protected, systems, melt down in shock and unhappiness. The reality is people want and need this. We do need to take a look at, obviously, the safeguards that have to be in place here, warning people, obviously, about accuracy, but also recognizing that this is not going to be HIPAA covered data, not that HIPAA is the be all and end all. Once you download your records. Now, I will note that the health data breach notification law that the FTC gets to enforce was put in place to deal with the fact that people were being encouraged to download their medical records. And then once you download it into some app and you can do what you please with it, it's no longer covered by HIPAA. And so that was put together specifically to give the FTC that extra edge, so that if at least there's a data breach. Now, under the prior FTC, I don't know that the current FTC has kind of relooked at this yet, but under the Lena Khan FTC, which obviously the current chairman has very different framing, what they did is they said, you know what, if you do something with data beyond the parameters of the privacy policy, that's a data breach. So, hey, we now have this enhanced jurisdiction. I was a little surprised because I'm like, no, a data breach is when data is breached. And that's what these data breach rules are for. And they argued, well, using the data beyond the way you are promising to use it makes it a breach. I don't know whether the current FTC will continue to take that view, but this certainly isn't unprotected. Anyway, it's a debate that will go on. Hopefully, it will continue to progress, and we'll have additional controls and protections so that we can actually use these things in a much more secure way. But this is why Congress really ought to act as well. There's been so much focus on, do we need an AI law? Should it preempt all the other rules and all that? And one thing I think that we have said is you need an AI law at a federal level, certainly, but you need a data protection law first. It's hard to do an AI law without a data protection law. Most of the states that have done AI laws did it on top of a data protection law. And most countries around the world that are looking at AI regulation or not already have data protection regulation. If you're in large part talking about protecting personal information and you haven't done things like, define the basic rules for sharing or selling or keeping or what you can do, it's just tricky to try to do AI first. And so I think we are expecting to see a proposal from the Republicans on the Energy and Commerce Committee. They've been working there, Dr. Joyce, on a Republican bill. I do think they intend to eventually broaden this, but are trying to get their arms around a Republican consensus first. But I do hope that perhaps developments like this, where people want this, they need it, but there are clearly huge sensitivities, and we understand that there are gaps because it is not HIPAA covered data, that there are gaps. Covering this with a federal privacy bill is essential to providing the backstop that I think would help a broader number of people be more comfortable. You were a little more skeptical. You're perhaps, more serious privacy concerned, than I. You were pointing out, a lot of the issues and concerns, and I think that's probably reflective of probably a lot of people watching. Would you feel better if there was a privacy law, or would you, want sort of you'd really want to trust, I guess, the company that you were, relying on as well, in addition to perhaps having a law to backstop it?
I think it depends on the law, depends on the company, depends on, a lot of things. So hard to say yes or no, one way or the other. But I do absolutely understand the value of it. And I think it also, I don't know if I would upload like lab results, but, before this call, we were talking about like, well, would you ask it this kind of question about health? And I think I'd be more willing to do some of the less sensitive or less specifically tied to me queries, but still slightly skeptical. But I absolutely understand the value of it.
A family member just fractured their wrist, and it's minor, and got an X-ray and got a cast, but we were like, well, how bad of a fracture is it, and like, does it really need a cast, and how long does it stay? I'm like, let's upload the X-ray, and we couldn't get it somehow. It was just the report, but we wanted to upload it to see whether the LLM was going to be like, because they are very good at reading scans, right? I mean, we see a lot of evidence that doctors, radiologists, and whatever, are sure that these things have been trained. They've seen so many, and when it's a matter of, is there a irregularity and all that sort of thing, some of them are super good. All right, well, thanks everybody who has joined us. Jameson, thanks for taking the time, and we'll look forward to continuing to discuss these issues, and happy Friday all.
Thanks.